I'm David Kiehn, historian for the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum. I'm going to talk about the filmmakers who shot footage of the San Francisco earthquake. The first film footage to be shot of the earthquake in San Francisco on April 18th was J.H. Lucas, who happened to be a San Francisco projectionist who had a 400-foot roll of film and somehow got a camera and shot footage on the morning of the earthquake on April 18th, the earliest known footage about the disaster. The next day he shot more footage from an automobile going down Market Street and then around the City Hall building that was destroyed by earthquake damage, but not the fire. That's all the footage he had, so that's all that he could take, and it was distributed by a guy in Kansas City, Missouri called Carl Menzing. The Miles brothers were the San Francisco-based movie company, but they had shot footage 4 days before the earthquake of the trip down Market Street film. And the night before the earthquake, Harry and Joe Miles boarded a eastbound train with the negative of that film and all of the camera equipment headed to their New York office. En route to New York, they heard about the disaster and arranged to have the film to continue on to New York, and then took a train back to San Francisco. They couldn't have gotten back to San Francisco any earlier than April 19th, and probably didn't even have a chance to film anything until the 20th, because they would have stopped in Oakland and had to somehow arrange getting back to San Francisco with the city ablaze and all of that chaos. So who knows when they actually did start shooting footage, but they had enough raw stock to film over 6,000 feet of film. That's just over 90 minutes of footage. They were the one company that shot the most footage at that time. The closest film production company beyond San Francisco was the Selig Polyscope Company in Chicago. And for whatever reason, William Selig chose not to send anybody to San Francisco to film the ruins or whatever they could gather, even though the trip at that point took about 3 days to go from Chicago to San Francisco. So all the other companies were on the East Coast. The Biograph company sent Billy Bitzer and Otis Gove to San Francisco. And whatever footage they shot, only about 1,200 feet was released. They were the one company that seemed to copyright everything, so there's a established provenance of exactly what they shot. That was all, I think, probably copyrighted with paper prints, so I believe all that survives. The other New York company that sent cameramen was the Edison Company, who sent Robert Bonine, and they shot about 1,400 feet of film. At least that was what was released. A fair amount of that survives as well. The Biograph Company in New York also sent Albert E. Smith to San Francisco to film the aftermath. As with the other New York companies, it took about 4 days to get to San Francisco, and then, of course, they had to arrange to get somebody or some equipment to help with carrying all the equipment and film stock. While Albert E. Smith was in San Francisco, the other camera operator at that point was another of the Biograph partners, J. Stuart Blackton, who was shooting film for the fiction films that Gilbert M. Anderson was directing for the company at that time. Anderson was Biograph's first outside director for the company, hired for that purpose. He had arrived at Biograph in July or August of 1905, and when the footage from the earthquake disaster came back to Biograph and they were working on distributing that film to theaters, Anderson was idle and not working on any fiction films and decided to leave the company at that point. Biograph shot about 2,200 feet of film, or at least that's how much was released to theaters. it seems like, as far as I can tell, very little of the Biograph footage seems to survive for whatever reason. As I mentioned before, the only company that really seemed to copyright anything was Biograph, and all the other companies were intent on getting the footage out as quickly as possible to theaters so that they could get the films shown and sell the prints. The Lubin Company sent Jack Frawley from their company headquarters in Philadelphia, and he shot just over 5,000 feet of film of the aftermath. Only a small portion of what Lubin film seems to survive. We happen to have one very nice copy with red tinted titles that we're releasing this weekend on the anniversary of the earthquake itself, 115 years after the earthquake. That's pretty nice quality footage of one of the few things that seems to survive from the Lubin Company. As I said before, the Miles brothers shot the most footage, but it's been a little harder to document just exactly what survives of their work. None of that was copyrighted. But from their descriptions, footage has been identified, some of it on the Internet Archive at archive.org from Rick Prelinger has got several pieces of footage that came from the Miles brothers. Just about 3 years ago, we re-premiered some footage that had been rediscovered and some fascinating footage that the Miles brothers shot down Market Street after the fire that would recreate their trip down Market Street, and then footage at the Ferry Building, and then footage of buildings being torn down. That roll of film was remarkable in that it had footage from 3 different Miles brothers cameras. They had at least 3 cameras at that point, and I know that Harry Miles and Jim Cerrone were probably 2 of the cameramen who were shooting that footage. Jim was based in San Francisco with Earl Miles, who may have been the 3rd operator running those 3 cameras, shooting all of the footage that the Miles brothers shot after the earthquake. Unfortunately, the Miles brothers studio at 1139 Market Street was destroyed in the fire, and they'd set up a temporary office at 790 Turk Street, which is at the cross street of Franklin. Fortunately, the Victorian 3-story house is no longer there, but they set up a laboratory on their 3rd floor to develop film. Could be that that's where Joe Miles was setting up the laboratory while the other 3 cameras were being used. One of the films that we're re-premiering this weekend also is about 150 feet of a panorama shot from Mason Street, starting out at the Fairmont Hotel, panning left overseeing the San Francisco Bay and Telegraph Hill, and ending up at the end of the street facing Angel Island. And I'm pretty sure that this footage was shot by the Miles brothers. It's listed in one of the compilations that they have of a larger collection of panoramas that they shot and released. And was advertised in June of 1906 when they were selling used footage of the aftermath of the earthquake. We're also showing Disaster in San Francisco, which is a Black Hawk compilation, thanks to Black Hawk Films and Serge Bromberg. This was a compilation that was done, I think, in the 1960s by Black Hawk, gathering up all of the film footage that they could find from the various filmmakers shooting footage of the disaster. And there's footage from, I assume, all that they could find everywhere from all of the filmmakers that converged on San Francisco at that time. So enjoy the programs.